Cześć, hello, vitam, and welcome to Pierogi Prayer, the official podcast of St. Joseph's Polish Apostolate of the Diocese of Camden, coming to you from our historic home at 1010 Liberty Street in Camden, New Jersey, the heart of South Jersey's Polonia for over 130 years. I am your host, Michael Matulevich. I'm probably writing for the last time before I die, for just 300 men of the 3rd Demi Brigade remain along with a few officers. All the rest are dead, including your brother, who died just a few months after arriving here. I write to you as hope disappears, reproaching myself for my foolishness of having wanted to see the Americas. I would not wish them on my worst enemy, and it would be better to remain a beggar in one's own country than to go to make one's fortune in America, where there are 1,000 diseases. Józef Zadora, 114th Demi Brigade, May 1803. Saint-Domingue. Few individuals have made such an impact on European history more than Napoleon Bonaparte. And for the Pole we just met, through his 300-year-old words, it wasn't always for their personal best. The image of the determined gaze in the diminutive Corsican, a hand regally tucked into the breast of his shirt, is iconic, to say the least. And where history leaves off, pop culture picks up. Often parodied, instantly recognizable, impossible to duplicate, Napoleon, a name synonymous with ambition and military genius, yet hand in hand with authoritarianism and a cult of personality. For Poles, the mark Napoleon left on their history has been one tinged with the standards of mythology and disappointment that we've come to know all too well from our Polish history. Inspired with the promise of a reestablished nation after the disaster of the partitions, Poles looked at Napoleon's rise and the chaos of the French Revolution as an opportunity, one to establish freedom in defiance of the old order of autocracy, which had seen them subjugated by their imperial neighbors. Great Polish poet Adam Mickiewicz summed up this feeling in a line from his epic poem Pan Tadeusz. Bitwa, gdzie? Które stronie? Pytają młodzieńcy. Witają broń, kobiety wznoszą w niebo ręce. Wszyscy pewni zwycięstwa, zwalniając łzami. Bóg jest z Napoleonem, Napoleon z nami. A battle? Where? In which direction? The young man asked. They seize their weapons, women raise their hands to the heavens, all certain of victory, cry out through their tears, God is with Napoleon, and Napoleon is with us. Yet, as is so often the case of Polish history, the spirit of Napoleon's promise, to which so many young men followed, was to run headlong into the reality of war. Many would have a rude awakening to disease and defeat far from their homeland, on a Caribbean island most had never even heard of. Countless volumes of study have been devoted to Napoleon Bonaparte since the incredible events of his life. A major contributor to that most recent study is our guest today. Jonathan North is a widely recognized expert on Napoleon and has written dozens of books and articles on various aspects of this time period. A particular interest of his has been the participation of Poles in Napoleon's armies and his various campaigns which spanned across the globe. Key to his work with the Poles has also been what professional historians call primary sources, which are the letters, diaries, and other works written during the events themselves, and are a goldmine for historical research, which is why we open this episode reading a quote from one of Jonathan's books. We were so fortunate to have the incredible opportunity to speak with Jonathan about the place of Napoleon and his relationship with Poland. It was a fascinating discussion that was too big to fit into one episode. As a result, we are releasing our interview in 2 parts, one after the other. And if I sound a little groggy at first, it owes to the time difference between the United Kingdom, where Jonathan lives, and the very early 4 o'clock a.m. time here in New Jersey that I had to do this interview. However, if you bear with our discussion, which I hope you would anyway, my brain does come more alive as the coffee kicks in later. Oh, and one disclaimer. I make no pretensions of speaking any word of French, other than maybe bonjour. So if I mispronounce anything that's a French word in this episode, I sincerely apologize. Try and check the hate mail if you can. Anyway, enjoy as we step back to Napoleon and Haiti. Welcome to Pedagogy to Prayer. It is truly an honor to have you on today. And thank you for joining us from the UK. It's about 4 o'clock in the morning here, and I imagine it's about 9 o'clock there. And we're really delighted to be able to talk to you about your wonderful work.
Thank you very much, Michael. It's a pleasure to be on, and thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. So, at the risk of not properly quantifying your achievements and your background, I noticed on your website that you have a list of some 19 books that you've written and about a particular time in history, which we will get into and how that affects the main subject of our show here, our podcast is Poland's history. But your work, if you can correct me if I'm wrong in any way, is around Napoleon Bonaparte. There are few people who appear in history like Napoleon and have such an impact on the world's history, not just French history, which is sort of where everyone kind of associates him with, even though he wasn't necessarily French. You could kind of make that argument being Corsican, but
Yeah.
but he certainly has this long-lasting and amazing impact on the world. So you can just maybe start out by talking a little bit about sort of what got you into the person of Napoleon Bonaparte and his history and his effects on the world, and then we can kind of go from there.
Yeah, I have indeed been interested in the Napoleonic period for what's getting on for 50 years now, half a century, and that makes me feel very old when I say that. But it's true. And I think there are very few periods in history which are named after somebody. And so when we talk about the Napoleonic period, Napoleonic Wars, Napoleon is obviously central to that. And he was a great man. And whether you think he was a good man or a bad man is a slightly different question. But there's absolutely no getting away from his centrality. And just his own story. He comes from nowhere, he rises up through his own talents and opportunities. And he crowns himself, literally crowns himself emperor of the French. So it is a great story. But I would always say that the period more generally is just as interesting as the story of Napoleon. So you've got the upheaval after the French Revolution. You've got this huge mix of ideas and political forces that are unleashed by the revolution, and they change Europe and the world forever. So it's a fascinating period. It's sometimes in the shadow of Napoleon, and in many ways it should really be the other way around. That Napoleon is a product of that period. So I think those are the things that have really sort of drawn me to that. And like you say, many of the things that emerged during that period are still with us today. So you get new ways of looking at the world. This idea, for example, the sovereignty of the people, it really forcefully emerges from the French Revolution. And we're still sort of battling with the idea of what does that mean, and um, how do we codify that into our own political systems. And the other thing that is unleashed by that idea of sovereignty of the people is something like nationalism. So which people are you talking about? Are you talking about the people that live in your country? Are you talking about your ethnic group? And of course, nationalism is also something that's incredibly strong, potent, and important. So you've got some really very strong ideas coming through that are sort of let off the lead, let off the leash, and go off and conquer the world. So I think there's something for, I would say there's something for everybody in this period. If you like beautiful clothes, tick. If you like beautiful music, tick. If you're interested in politics, tick.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think that's a wonderful way to put the history, and it's as someone who's studied history and to try to convey it. And the importance of it, and how, there's a lot of times these misconceptions, particularly when you get into Polish history, like I do, about the sort of the place of what nationalism and ethnic identity are, because they are two very different factors a lot of times that is really not appreciated in the modern age. And people, by and large, this sort of popular understanding of history, we have a lot of times there's this sort of retrograde amnesia about even more recent events. But then the further back you go, the less of an understanding there is, and the less of an understanding of what that impact had and how it defines modern events based on the history, because it is, you can never separate the two, especially in
Mm.
European history. Today, it's such a product. But then you also hear our understanding of European history is so often defined in terms of the people that came here and sort of sired us. By and large,
Mm.
Poles in the United States are, and many other ethnic groups, are part of this immigration wave that happened 100 years ago, over 100 years ago. And
Yeah.
the Poland was not static, nor was Europe in general. And to try and understand that today here, that it just is, we just have this sort of understanding of what our ethnicity is from that time period without understanding how it is today. And it's almost a constant battle to try and explain that
Yeah.
in many ways.
Yeah.
So,
I think that's very true. And I think that, I mean, you mentioned I've written a lot of books. I have looked at the Polish experience quite a lot in this period. And I think that I've been quite drawn to it because I think the Polish experience sort of sums up some of the turmoil, some of those ideas, some of those forces at play following the French Revolution, and the impact of that revolution on Poland and vice versa has been something that's been very interesting for me. I think, but alongside of that, I think there's also, when you look at the Poles in the Napoleonic period, you get this sense of adventure, um, this kind of there's an element of daring do and bravery that's admirable, and so you kind of drawn to that story too. And of course, typical Polish stubbornness and bloody-mindedness is also part of the Polish story in the Napoleonic period. But I think possibly for me, what really caught my imagination was this idea that um, why was it that Poles were prepared to sacrifice so much for Napoleon when, from a very early stage, it was pretty clear that he was going to use the Poles? And I just wonder, I like that idea of loyalty, but I also wonder about loyalty for a lost cause in a way, or for a cause that doesn't appreciate you. And I think that that intellectual idea is a really interesting, fascinating one. So I think it's only really in 1813, towards the end of the Napoleonic Wars, where Poles start to realise that Napoleon had used them a bit. But up until then, they've been really loyal, and I think that the the truth and the honest answer is that they were loyal because they hoped Napoleon would eventually permit them a greater degree of independence. But of course, Napoleon being Napoleon, it was always true that he was going to make the most out of them, like he made the most out of everybody. I mean, he's that kind of leader. So even within the sort of huge political movements and pictures, you've got these smaller currents of these smaller dynamics going on, and I think that makes a really interesting mix. So you've got that higher level politics, and you've got that personal, those personal stories of struggle and loyalty and cause.
yeah, that's an interesting point, because and so if we sort of situate ourselves in the timeline here, so 1789, Poland is dismembered by Russia, Prussia, and Austria, fails to, ceases to exist for all intensive purposes, and essentially coincides with the timeline of the French Revolution and the rise of Napoleon. And so then, as Napoleon is sort of making his way, he
becomes first consul, and later crowns himself emperor, and all this, this sort of basic history. So as on his march eastward, he does begin to absorb some of these, particularly the German states, and sort of makes these vassal states in a way, client states, if you will. So there was a pattern that he sort of implemented on his march east, and so in terms of, like you mentioned, the Poles would have been able to see this, and so what is there anything in particular that you come across that would account for the difference, and even just not noticing how things were coming for them?
Mhm. Yeah, I think it's uniquely down to those partitions that you mentioned. So the Poles are divided between the three great big Central Eastern European powers that really dictate what goes on in the continent, especially during the upheaval of the French Revolution. So although the French Revolution and Republican forces are eventually successful, for a period of about 6 or 7 years, it's an internal French question. It's an anarchical, chaotic situation in France, and I think the Central European powers take advantage of that to reshape Europe a little bit. When Napoleon emerges as being on top, then it's in his interest and the interest of France to reshape Europe and undo some of what the Germans, the Austrians, Prussians, and the Russians had done. Um, and once he beats them in battle, that's obviously something that he sets about doing. Um, in a sense, Poland is a little bit too far east for him to have the same impact that he has on, say, West Germany, where his rule, his regime is in power a little bit longer. So the Polish experiment, it only really lasts from 1807 to 1812. And in of itself, it's not complete restoration of Poland. It's taking the bit that belonged to Prussia, that the Prussians had taken, and making it a duchy. And he gives that to the King of Saxony to rule over. So it's very much a compromise, not really upsetting things too much. And Poland's role in the Napoleonic Empire is a bit of a vassal status. It's an auxiliary to provide men, money, and also to be used as a kind of something you could trade, something you could use to threaten the Austrians. You could threaten the Russians and say, look, if you don't behave, I'm going to give Poland more territory. It's a little bit of a manipulation. He does that in Germany too, but Germany's got established kingdoms, established kings, and he treats the German kings with a little bit more respect. And the Poles, because they don't have that leadership, I think, they get used a little bit more. I'm sorry to say it, because I do admire Napoleon for many of the things he achieved, but here I think he's a bit more manipulative than perhaps is always presented in history.
Yeah, and it's, I think, part of the mythology of Napoleon is kind of tied into even just the story of how he was either presented himself, or just in terms of this liberté, égalité spirit of the French Revolution, of overturning the old order and the old monarchies. And I mean, there was this famous case of Ludwig von Beethoven, who was going to establish his, or dedicate his third symphony to him, and Ludwig, who had sort of republican tendencies, and then after the conquest of Vienna and him sort of reestablishing himself as a monarch, famously scratched it out. It was kind of
Yeah.
this famous, and so I wonder, though, if it was just sort of this kind of what Napoleon's image as this republican hero, and then for it to be a little bit crestfallen. But then it's interesting that he was treating states that were monarchical, with more respect, as you said,
Yeah,
than the Poles who were kind of pining for this semi-republican
yeah.
identity.
I think it's I mean, you can't really take Napoleon out of the revolution. It was the revolution that made him. It was the revolution that gave him his opportunities. He would have been a low-ranking officer in the had the royal army, had the monarchy in France continued. He wouldn't have been anything particularly special. It's a revolution that opened up the career path and the opportunities for him. But he kind of, once he achieves power and influence, he kind of puts the brake on a lot of those impulses and says, "Whoa, hang on a minute, we shouldn't go too far." Um, and he sets about creating his own dynasty, which partly merges with the old French aristocracy and the European aristocracy, but is partly a new dynasty based around his family. So one of the things he did in Germany was he made one of his younger brothers king of Westphalia, which was a new state he set up. He made his elder brother Joseph king of Naples and then king of Spain. And I think at one point there was an idea that he would take his brother-in-law, um, someone called Joachim Murat, who is married to his sister Caroline, and make him king of Poland. But I think because Poland had a monarchy, that was a little bit more complicated, and he never, in fact, got round to doing anything like that.
Hmm.
He
Yeah.
he tended to prefer the Poniatowski family and sort of big them up a little bit. But there was that idea, I think, that he could rule Europe through his family, which is it's a very Corsican way of looking at power politics.
Hmm. That's interesting. Yeah, and I want to get into Haiti at some point, but I found out in kind of doing some of the background research for this episode how I didn't know that Leclerc, who was the leader of the expedition to Haiti, was also his brother-in-law. Um,
Absolutely, yeah.
so we can, like I said, I do want to get
It
into.
definitely is a family affair. Yeah,
Yeah, I definitely want to get into that. But so I will back up a little bit. So we'll situate ourselves now in Poland and sort of the history of the Polish legions as they've come to be known. And so, for better or worse, Napoleon he sort of treats Poland how he does, and one of these ways is to recruit military units from it. So maybe you talk a little bit about sort of what your research into the Polish legions themselves, what their makeup was, uh, what it may have attracted Poles to join, and recruitment methods and things like that, and then sort of maybe with the makeup, because I know you've worked a lot with the primary sources,
yeah,
so I'm sure that tells even a different story than the historical narrative may have. I think a lot of people, when they hear about the Polish legions, they usually think of Dąbrowski's march because it's now the Polish national anthem, of course, and his unit famously raised in Italy, and sort of marched to Poland. This whole sort of mythology. So maybe just talk a little bit more about that and your experience with it, and anything to
yeah,
that nature.
yeah. Well, I'm glad you mentioned the national anthem because when I spoke a little bit earlier about one of the great things about this period is the music, and you mentioned Beethoven, but also it produces two great national anthems, and I can say that because over here in the UK we've got a national anthem that sounds like something you'd play at a cat's funeral. It's really awful, but there are two really good European national anthems. And one of them, of course, is the Marseillaise, which is a product of the revolution. And it's a very, very stirring tune. And the other one, of course, is the March March Dąbrowski, which is all about the Polish legions. So it's very appropriate that we mention that one today. Um, like you say, March March Dąbrowski is about the Polish legions in Italy, and it's a little bit odd that Italy's involved at all, but the basic story is that after the last partition, and at that point in time, Poland disappears. The only enemy to Prussia, Austria, and Russia is revolutionary France. And it seems a bit odd that Polish nobility, many of the soldiers were, after all, aristocratic, from aristocratic families, would look to revolutionary France as a potential ally. But I think it's the typical case of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So you get a little exodus of Polish officers from Poland who moved to France. France is fighting on many fronts. It had a war with Spain. It had a war in Germany. But the big front is Italy, and the French invaded Italy 1796. So that's perfect timing. They needed troops. They needed boots on the ground, as we say nowadays. And the Polish officers volunteered to raise a legion, a force which would be infantry and cavalry, to fight for the French in Italy. And I think it was Napoleon who met Dombrowski in late 1796, and they agreed on raising this unit, which would be officered by immigrant Pole officers. But the soldiers, the foot soldiers, would be raised from Austrian prisoners of war or deserters. So you kind of have this duality from quite early on, that the officers are quite high-minded and have this cause, but many of the soldiers are quite keen just to get out of prison camps and back into service where they could get food and paid and get on with their lives. But the overall result is that it becomes a very effective force, and it's deployed in Italy against Austrians. And the idea amongst the Poles is that if this war goes successfully, then Napoleon, or the French Republic as it was then, would reward them by eventually forcing Austria in a peace treaty to hand back bits of Poland it stole and make those independent. So there's always this idea that if they fought well and were loyal, then that's what would happen, even though they were in Italy.
Yeah, I've noticed that too, just in the sort of historiography, that is the ultimate narrative. It was, if we that loyalty piece, that if you did fight well, you proved yourself, then you would essentially be rewarded. Um, and so on that, I'd like to talk a little bit about, because I know this, you said this was an interest of yours when we were communicating before, about the Polish Legion's experience in Haiti, which is something that is, in the Polish community, something that I've heard mentioned. People who even don't have necessarily great understanding of history, they know about the story of Poles in Haiti as this sort of moment of pride for the Poles. And part of this, what's called the Leclerc expedition, or the beginning of it, that was sent to Haiti. Peace essentially breaks out in Europe, so Napoleon's able to sort of concentrate on his colonial affairs, which the colony of Saint-Domingue, which had been sort of this cash cow for the French Empire, the sugar and the coffee production that was done there. And then this slave revolt breaks out in the late 1700s and lasts for decades, essentially, the effects of it. And so it's a place that Napoleon would like to see able to become profitable again, and so he has this idea to send this expedition back to retake Saint-Domingue, as it's known then. And within this group that he sends, this 50 ship, I think it was, group of I think it was about 30,000 soldiers. I don't remember the exact numbers. Maybe you can correct me. He sends along famously these 5,000 Poles, who get there and promptly, like most of the European armies sent to the Caribbean, most of them die from yellow fever, or some other disease. But in short order, after fighting, here and there, many of them famously desert. And the reason is always given as this sense that the Haitians were fighting for their independence against an oppressor. And the Poles, seeing this, having been sent here thousands of miles away from their homeland that they are ostensibly fighting for, hoping to prove themselves and be rewarded, as we kind of said, they desert and they sort of join over to the Haitian side of things. And many of them choose to stay. They're actually incorporated into the Haitian constitution, mentioned by name. And once the part of the revolution essentially is over. And even today, their descendants have settled in certain areas, and there's Haitians that maintain features of the Poles. There are images of Our Lady of Chenstohova that have been incorporated into some of these Haitian voodoo deities. And so I know you said you've worked a little bit about that. So just talk about maybe a little bit about that experience, what you've come across in terms of this Haitian experience, Haitian Polish experience,
Yeah,
that is so well known.
it's a fascinating story. I think it's one of those stories again that's unleashed by the French Revolution. So you've got two different peoples on different sides of the world brought together by the French Revolution, not necessarily in a great way, but it's just those forces that draw them together. So, like you say, Haiti, San Domingo, as it then was a huge West Indies factory for coffee, sugar, indigo. It's very wealthy, entirely based on slavery, very small white population, very big African population doing the work. And then when the French Revolution comes, there's a slave revolt, um, which the French motherland is unable to deal with. And eventually, I think it's 1793, because of the political situation in Paris in France, they declare the abolition of slavery, um, liberty, equality, and fraternity. Um, but they kind of lose the economic advantages of having that colony. And it's a rather chaotic situation for many years. And when Napoleon assumes power, he's, as we mentioned, is inclined to be politically conservative and putting the brakes on some of these ideas in the French Revolution. And he'd rather like to go back to the status as it was before, where the West Indies were providing a lot of money and a lot of colonial goods to France. And it's his idea to reassert French control over the West Indies. Now, there's a school of thought that when Napoleon puts together this expedition to do that, which is an expedition that will eventually be required to restore slavery, so that's not going to be an easy thing to put the genie back in the bottle. There's a school of thought that he gets together all of the rabidly Republican Jacobin generals and soldiers and sends them to almost certain death in the West Indies. But it's not actually true. Like you say, the chief commander in chief of the expedition is General Leclerc, who's married to Napoleon's favourite sister, Pauline. And many of the generals that go on the expedition are actually Napoleon loyalists. They're good generals, and they go with the idea that they will go to the West Indies, marry the daughter of a plantation owner, and get very rich. So there's a lot of optimism about this expedition. It's only when they get there that they realize it's not going to work out like this at all. So they're totally decimated by yellow fever. And when they get there, a few months after their arrival, they don't immediately declare slavery reimposed, but in Guadeloupe, the French do restore slavery, and it's that news that comes over to Haiti, and there's an enormous rebellion, and there are all sorts of massacres, a lot of fighting, a lot of really bloody brutal fighting. And very quickly the French realised they need reinforcements. And so Napoleon scrapes together some troops from Italy, including the Poles, and sends 5,000 Poles out as quickly as he can, with some Germans and some Swiss and some French deserters, anyone he can get hold of to bolster the numbers. And the Poles are, some of them think, when you read their letters and the diaries, some of them think this is quite an adventure. Here we go around the world. But others are really quite shocked. And there's one, Mikhail Sokolnitsky, who's writing in 1802 from Genoa. And he's really upset that those who had fought for liberty, he says, and could tolerate no oppressor, shall now go and place free men in chains and make a trade of them. So he's really angry that, you've spent 4 years fighting in Italy for liberty and fraternity, and now you're going to go to the West Indies and put chains on people. So there's a lot of disquiet, let alone the fact that you could be massacred in the plantations of Haiti, or you could die from yellow fever. But there's a lot of political disquiet too. And indeed, when the Poles land, within a couple of weeks, half of them are dead from yellow fever. It's an astonishing number. There's no mercy from that disease. So there's that, and the survivors. I think what happens is the sense of reluctance, which I mentioned, and their reluctance to take part in some of the massacres. There are a couple of famous massacres where the French troops disarm and kill Haitian soldiers, and the Poles refuse to take part in those. And so there's a general called Paul Louverture, who's brother of the more famous Toussaint Louverture, who notices this. And so the Poles get a little bit more of a reputation amongst the French troops as being sympathetic to the plight of the blacks. And subsequent Haitian historians have made quite a lot of this, but there really does seem to be a sense that the Poles are not willing to get involved in this war that they don't really see as being their war. They don't have that kind of skin in the game, and they stand aloof and apart from a lot of the operations. In fact, this brings down a lot of criticism from the French generals about the Poles, saying that they're not very good soldiers and they're very reluctant. And I don't really think that helps Polish morale when you've just lost half of your regiment and the generals are disrespecting you like that. But it does lead to quite a few desertions, and when the whole campaign collapses and the French evacuate and try and escape, many of the Poles surrender to the Haitians rather than evacuate. So in the end, I think there are about 400 Poles left in Haiti after the French evacuate, either former prisoners of war or as deserters. And the new ruler of Haiti, someone called General Dessalines, who will become emperor of Haiti, he's got a personal bodyguard that's made up of Poles and Germans. And I think even some Polish cavalry puts them on horses, and he keeps them as his own kind of personal entourage, a bit like the Swiss Guard of the popes. So that's a very interesting story. Like you say, the other element to that is that the new constitution that the people of Haiti produce guarantees a special status for Poles and Germans, and provides for their protection on condition that they no longer support the French. So I think later on the French will have another go and attempt to come back, and the idea is that the Poles are now citizens of Haiti, with an equal status, which is very unusual given that all the French settlers, all the French colonists are completely purged and murdered and chased off to New Orleans and places like that. So it's a very unique situation, a very interesting story, and you're absolutely right that there are some villages, and I mean Haiti's been through an awful lot of political turmoil in recent years too. So I'm not entirely sure of the situation nowadays, but um, there are some Polish names still in Haiti, and there is that tradition still there. Yeah.
Yeah, and even doing some of the research for this episode, I kind of fell down the rabbit hole of Haitian history at a certain point, and it's absolutely fascinating. That entire campaign, and just this sort of, from a military standpoint, it seemed like the French had this. They really relied on living off the land in Europe, and couldn't do that in Haiti. So they were going to rely on these supply lines from the U.S. In a lot of ways, and it just kind of fell apart. And it just really is a fascinating history. And then in the United States particularly, we have this kind of fixation on race relations in our history, and that's goes back to our sort of original sin of slavery,
Mm.
institutionalized here. And that narrative was so much a part of the Haitian revolution, that it was always seen as kind of this race war, when it was, but it wasn't. There were so many different elements of it. It wasn't. It was a class struggle in so many ways. And
Yeah.
then, so it was just this terms of, but that, I mean, that goes to also what sort of the modern United States understanding of race, and then sort of then, and also the European understanding of it in the French mind. It's really just a very fascinating history. I've
It,
found.
it's a fascinating story, and I think that when Napoleon sends his expedition, it's fully important to remember that at that point he's at peace with Britain. So they've got this Treaty of Amiens, and there's, for the first time since the Revolutionary Wars started in 1792, there's peace with Britain. That means that the sea is open to French trade and French shipping for the first time in sort of 10 years, and also that the French own Louisiana still, and so the interconnection between the West Indies and this French potential French colony in Louisiana is such that Napoleon also organizes an expedition to sail to Louisiana. In the end, it doesn't sail because I think the expedition to Haiti is such a disaster that he kind of calls off the further ambition to create this French empire in the sort of West Indies and Louisiana, Florida kind of area. But had that paid off, I mean, that would have had a huge impact on American history and the history of the region. It's one of those interesting what if
Mm.
moments. But of course, the peace with Britain, it doesn't last very long. And the Royal Navy again comes out of the ports, and it's used to stop Napoleon sending more troops to Haiti. And eventually, Napoleon just gives up on the colony, and he also sells off Louisiana to the United States for a large sum of money, um, and everyone's happy. So yeah, there's even within the story being interesting and multi-dimension, there's also that other sort of nearly told what if story as well.
Yeah, and I think too that I don't usually. I think you can get down the rabbit hole of what ifs in history fairly easily, but I do think that it's worth exploring when it comes to that story of Haiti and Louisiana, because, like you said, that narrative that had or that theory that he had kind of sent these Jacobin, this expedition that was doomed to fail, this suicide mission, I don't think holds up in the court of history, because I think the territorial ambitions of domination of the Gulf of Mexico, colonially from Haiti to Louisiana, was absolutely on the plate.
Yeah.
Absolutely, I mean, it was because it was such a cash flow colony for the French Empire. I mean, it was, one of the quotes I had read, it was this description of Haiti, and said Haiti was hell, but Haiti was rich. I mean, it was about, and even you look at the British colonial, or the other colonial, not just the British, but the Dutch, there were all these, the reason the colonies existed, it was to support the mother country, and it was a lifeline for the establishment of empire. So I
Yeah.
don't think, and I certainly don't think Napoleon would have been so careless, as to just send a suicide expedition. That just doesn't seem, in my reading of his history, his character.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the key there is that he sent his brother-in-law, who actually died of yellow fever quite quickly, and his sister came back with the ashes, and that's a giveaway that he's thinking big. Again, it's this family mafia that he has, but he would have quite liked um, Leclerc and Pauline as viceroys of the Indies or something. It's a very ambitious goal, and at that point, Spain was also a French ally. It had come around and sided with Napoleon. So half of the island of Saint Domingue is Spanish and half was French. And I think probably he would have done a deal. He was great at making deals. The art of the deal was something Napoleon was strong in. He would have probably taken over the whole island as well. So it was immensely wealthy. It was immensely fertile.
We hope that you have enjoyed this part one of our interview with Jonathan North on Napoleon, Poland, and Haiti. Be sure to listen to part two.